So Hatred came out in 2015, but I never got around to playing it until last week. And when I did, I couldn't help but immediately start making comparisons to the Postal series, but more particularly Postal 1 and its remaster, Postal Redux. They share similarities in their dark and violent themes, but they differ in tone, execution, and narrative intent, because these are two games where the main character wakes up and chooses violence, but in very different ways. Both are isometrical twin-stick shooters, which essentially means you look down on the chaos from above like some sort of vengeful deity, while your character runs around committing heinous acts with the grace of a malfunctioning Roomba.
Now that's a boomstick.
Even though both games use this perspective, Hatred takes the more quote-unquote realistic route because everything's more desaturated and grim, like a black and white crime documentary that somehow came to life. Meanwhile, Postal is pixelated and weird, making you feel like you're playing a game designed by a very angry, very sleep-deprived cartoonist.
Only my weapon understands me.
And before I forget, I'm your favorite underdog, Crushy OG, reminding you to support the channel because my self-esteem is directly tied to my subscriber count. And make sure to let me know which one of these games was your favorite down in the comments. Alright, let's get back to it. The thing is, Postal knows it's ridiculous. Even in the first game, which was darker and more serious, there was still an over-the-top, almost surreal quality to it. Later games like Postal 2 and Postal 4 fully embrace the absurdity, turning the series into a satirical, chaotic mess where the player can choose to be violent or just deliver mail and pee on things. And spoiler warnings are in effect for the following titles. But the first game, released in 1997, was infamous for its dark and violent subject matter, putting players in the role of a seemingly unhinged man who believes the world is out to get him. Again, unlike the later entries, particularly the second, which leaned heavily into satire and dark comedy, the original Postal played its premise disturbingly straight. It kind of reminds me of that Michael Douglas movie Falling Down, if you stripped away the social commentary and just let him go completely off the rails from the start.
Mister, where are you going? No, you sit down there and you finish your lunch, come on.
Both are about a guy who just snaps and goes on a violent rampage. But while Falling Down tries to make you sympathize with the main character's descent into madness, Postal is more like, yeah, this guy's completely unhinged and have fun with that. However, despite this heavy subject matter, Postal had an overbearing charm rooted in its unique presentation and design. The game's exaggerated isometric perspective and comic book style visuals gave it an almost dreamlike quality. But Hatred, on the other hand, takes itself way too seriously. It's like a high schooler's attempt at writing the darkest, grittiest story ever, but instead of being deep, it just comes off as laughably try-hard. And while I don't believe Hatred is objectively better than Postal, I will be fair enough to say that I do think it has a few good things going for it. The visuals have a distinct, gritty style that really sells the bleak atmosphere, and the gameplay, while simple, does have a certain destructive satisfaction to it. It's not the most refined or deep game, but if you're looking for something purely focused on carnage, it delivers in its own way. The animations are surprisingly fluid, the environments are highly destructible, and the world feels much more sprawling and open compared to Postal 1. While the gameplay itself might not be the most engaging, there are definitely aspects of its presentation and mechanics that stand out. And for comparison's sake, both games have very similar heads-up displays, presenting their weapons at the bottom center of the screen and grenade selections on the right. Furthermore, in Hatred, the player executes enemies in order to regain health, but in Postal, health pickups are scattered around the map just like an arcade shooter. And Postal actually has a filter in its effects section called Like That Other Game, which puts a black and white screen on just to mock its rival. Both games have semi-open environments where you progress from one area to the next while fighting waves of enemies. However, because of Postal's dreamlike presentation, you move through locations like trailer parks, train yards, and military bases, all feeling somewhat disconnected, like the Postal dude is spiraling deeper into madness.
Goodbye.
The environments, while bleak, have this exaggerated feel as if you're navigating through someone's paranoid delusion. But Hatred has a more grounded suburban hellscape. You start in a house, move through neighborhoods, shopping centers, and industrial zones, but everything feels eerily real. The game's black and white aesthetic, with only splashes of red, reinforces its grim, nihilistic tone, because unlike Postal, where you sometimes feel like you're in an exaggerated comic book world, Hatred wants you to feel like you're in a real, decaying society, and I did have a little bit of an appreciation for that. And while both games follow a homicidal maniac, the conclusions to these stories take very different approaches. After you've gunned down hundreds of people in Postal, you reach the final level, an elementary school. But just as you're about to unleash hell, the screen fades to black. However, due to its controversial nature, the ending to Postal Redux plays out a little bit differently than the original. The game now concludes at the Air Force Base, followed by a cutscene showing the Postal dude collapsing near a church beside a casket. But they both inevitably reach the asylum ending, which is the final gut punch that pulls back the curtain on the entire game, revealing that the Postal dude was just completely insane all along. It's a subversive ending that pulls the rug out from under the player. After all the chaos, it turns out the Postal dude was never some unstoppable force. He was just some mentally unstable outlaw, and now the world has removed him from the equation. And the ending of Hatred is like the final boss of over-the-top nihilism. After spending the entire game on an ultra-violent rampage, the antagonist decides that shooting people just isn't enough and chooses to blow up a nuclear power plant.
I only wonder if those explosives will work.
This dude storms into the nuclear facility on his final side quest given by Satan himself to delete the entire map. It's equally cliche and epic. Like if every edgelord villain trope decided to throw a going away party in the middle of a nuclear reactor. It's basically the ultimate fine I'll take my ball and go home moment, except the ball is a nuclear reactor and now home is a radioactive crater. Between the two games, I would definitely say that Postal had the better ending because at least it felt like the game was in on the joke. It knew it was being wild and just kind of rolled with it, and gave me something satisfying to ponder afterwards.
Stand bastards with coupons.
While Hatred took itself so seriously that I half expected it to start quoting the Columbine Diaries at me. Both games got DLC updates that added extra gameplay modes, giving players new ways to cause destruction. Postal introduced Rampage mode, which turned the game into a high-score arcade-style bloodbath. Instead of just making your way through levels, you're graded on how efficiently and stylishly you take down your enemies, turning the chaos into a competitive challenge. Meanwhile, Hatred added Survivor mode, which is basically a horde-style mode where you fight off endless waves of enemies in different areas. It strips away the edgy narrative and focuses purely on combat, letting players see how long they can last before they're overwhelmed.
That's what she said.
The two modes leaned into their game's core appeal. Postal embraced its satirical over-the-top nature with a scoring system, while Hatred focused on its grim arcade-style combat. In the end, both updates gave players a reason to keep playing. Overall, Postal set the stage for controversy-driven games with its unapologetic violence and dark humor. Hatred tried to capitalize on that legacy, but instead of making an impact, it just collapsed under the weight of its own edginess. Where Postal found a cult following by balancing its shock value with satire and absurdity, Hatred lacked substance beyond its controversy, leaving it as little more than a forgettable footnote in gaming history. Now, honestly, I'm wondering what you think. Did you ever play the original Postal? Do you remember every execution animation? I bet you don't. Prove it to me in the comments. And I'll see you in the next one.